Matt Question Authority.
This is the currency of the resistance. What is Bitcoin?
So we ended 2014 with the U.S. Marshals auctioning off some more of their Bitcoin. Enter 2015, and we see the arrival of the banks and them trying to figure out a way to how to have blockchain without Bitcoin. This was the year that we had blockchain, not Bitcoin. And in fact, I'm going to skip ahead to this headline from Bloomberg Markets on October 25th, 2015. And it has on the cover Blythe Masters, the former head of the precious metals trading desk over at JP Morgan. And it's all about the blockchain, they claim.
So this is an attempt by the banks to nudge their way into this emerging market. And they can't recognize Bitcoin as such because it's a competitive threat. So they've decided that the underlying technology of blockchain is something that they want to be involved with, and that if they can push blockchain over Bitcoin, they can get into this business but without having the competitor of Bitcoin. And Blythe Masters is a well-known character on Wall Street who created and invented the credit default swap to help Exxon avoid all kinds of taxes and environmental penalties.
There is a very good quotation by Bill Gates writing on a book in '95 that the internet will not be important. What will be important is instead the highway of information. Internet will just be a small part of the highway of information, but the most important thing is not the internet, is what is the concept beyond the internet. Blockchain is the same. I think it comes from the typical Kubler-Ross elaboration of loss theory. Basically, at the beginning, something bad, something that scares you, something that is causing a loss to your business, for example. At the beginning, it's denial. It doesn't exist. Then it becomes rage. It does exist, but it's evil, and we are going to shut it down. Then it's bargain. So it does exist, but only at my condition, and I will create new words in order to deal with it at my condition. And blockchain is this third phase, basically. First, Bitcoin doesn't exist. It's a joke. Then Bitcoin does exist, but it's dangerous, and we're going to shut it down. But then we don't want to appear like dinosaurs. So we do have to say something. We cannot say Bitcoin, so we will say blockchain.
Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Time now to turn to Tony Gallippi, CEO of BitPay.com, and Marcel Rolland. He's BitPay's European GM. Let's talk about Bitcoin versus blockchain. Now, I have a theory here, and you tell me what you think about it. My theory is that Bitcoin came and the bankers missed it. They completely missed it. They didn't understand the technology. They didn't understand the beauty of it. They didn't understand how it can transform finance and economics. Then a few years after that, the penny dropped and they said, oh, you know what, this is ingenious, but they couldn't admit the fact that they missed it, so they talk about blockchain instead.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see when you go into emerging markets and you ask them, do you use Facebook or do you use the internet? More people say, yes, I use Facebook, but they don't realize that they're using the internet. So yeah, Bitcoin is an application for the blockchain. There are other applications for the blockchain, you know, being contracts and property rights, but the fact that banks are engaged now and participating, I think, is a good thing. And no matter what they want to call it, it doesn't matter. You know, they're still building on the same platform that we're building on.
In the beginning, when Bitcoin was seen as a rebel technology almost, and it was seen as fighting, you know, the white paper from Satoshi mentioned, you know, after the 2008 crisis, a certain distrust of the banks in some way. And yet now the banks are adopting it. And this huge cost efficiency that comes with moving money through the ledger. I mean, are the banks simply going to use the cost efficiency to pad their own pockets, number one? Number two, do we care?
They may. I think the best analogy is the telecom industry when voice over IP came out. You know, they adopted it under the hood, and for a while they were still charging carrier rates for all the calls, even though they were realizing a lot of savings underneath.
A theme I've talked about here is the pinwheel in the eyes phenomenon. And the banks looked at Bitcoin and they started to lose their minds because they thought, well, here is a competitor to us, Bitcoin. It competes with fiat money. But this blockchain thing, we could use that to settle trades in our back office and save a lot of money. So they started to dance with the devil by talking about it openly. Bitcoin, blockchain became normalized. They pushed the whole technology, how it works, and more people understood the genius of it. And so, again, Bitcoin is like a parasite, and they're using the banks to further the virus. And the banks just bought hook, line, and sinker this meme, this Bitcoin technology, and they are co-opted effectively. And as history progresses, we see that they were fooled by Bitcoin like so many others before it. As it moves up from just having a bunch of internet gamers at the base level to now the major banks, international banks, sovereigns, and it just enters the bigger coliseum, if you will, of the gladiator wars of currency and Forex battles.
Well, I took a detour myself through that as well, working for Symbiont, which is a blockchain, not Bitcoin company. And I thought in the beginning that was the way that the blockchain adoption would go. It's almost like, to use Andreas Antonopoulos' analogy, intranet before internet, the walled gardens before the CTOs were willing to open up their own corporate architecture to the internet itself. And essentially the blockchain, not Bitcoin, was going in that direction.
Banks are members of the Federal Reserve System. We've seen over the past few years, they have all this free money of quantitative easing that the Federal Reserve Bank prints uniquely for them, these participants in this global financial system. Now they look at Bitcoin, they see it as a competitor, and what they want to do is take the blockchain part of it and add their permissions.
Right, well, blockchain without Bitcoin is like Catholicism without hell. Right? So they want all the goodies without the pain of having a competitor in their space, Bitcoin, which would destroy the fiat money fractional reserve empires that they've built over the past few decades since the deregulatory period of the 1980s. And it hasn't worked because what they came up with was a centralized, permissioned, walled garden approach to this Bitcoin technology, and that is a complete 180-degree about face to what the technology is all about. Yeah, they can save a few bucks on the back office by clearing trades instantaneously because the clearing and the trade are at the same time using blockchain. That's true. But they nevertheless simply got sucked into the Bitcoin black hole, the Bitcoin vortex that is educating now a whole new class of bankers what this Bitcoin thing is all about. So they were fooled again by the protocol.
I believe that banks at some stage, they already went through the phase of trying to deny Bitcoin's existence and laughing at the people in the very early days. They then tried to co-opt it and take the word Bitcoin out of it and use the word blockchain to popularize. And that tended to actually create lots of attention to our industry and attention to Bitcoin in the end. Now I believe that Bitcoin is going to be adopted by most of the major and powerful financial institutions as they launch their cryptocurrency and Bitcoin exchanges. This will create a two-tiered market. The first market will be people using Bitcoin as it was designed to be used, on a hardware wallet, peer-to-peer, and independent of any financial engineering that can manipulate the money supply of Bitcoin. And then there'll be a regulated market, and the regulated market will be people that provide all their documentation, give it to the exchange, give it to the bank, and then the bank will enforce regulations and rules about where you can spend it. And then eventually they'll create derivatives products and rehypothecate it and create a fake synthetic Bitcoin. Those two things are going to exist side by side, and they're both going to have their use case. Many people might onboard through the banking's version of Bitcoin, and then they realize when they can't spend their own money, own their own money, and that it's rehypothecated through a synthetic financial product, that they might actually want to own their own money, spend their own money, and engage in the monetary policy that rewards the saver rather than the person taking on debt.
March 2015, Goldman Sachs reveals in their report that China is actually the most important player in Bitcoin. It's now emerged that 8 out of 10 Bitcoin trades are actually settling in yuan. Remember, Bitcoin is also part of the global monetary experiments happening. We've talked about QE1, we talked about QE2, we talked about QE3. All of these things are going on at the same exact time that all of these experiments with magical internet money that is Bitcoin happened. In China as well, at this same time, we are seeing radical accumulation of debt. Never ever before seen in history that the accumulation of debt at the same exact time during this post-financial crisis, while our governments and central banks in the West are doing quantitative easing and lowering interest rates to zero, what China was doing at the same time was basically leveraging up the country like 100-fold in the same exact time in order to rescue the global economy. They go on a massive spending spree. They build massive roads, high-speed trains. They're building all sorts of new electric capacity. And they, in fact, have built so much electric capacity over the previous 5 years that there is free energy for these miners in China to start printing money. Accumulating Bitcoin, they enter the market. They're dominating the market. We in the West, of course, weren't paying much attention, so we didn't know that suddenly there's Bitmain. Suddenly they have all the ASICs. Suddenly they're kicking everybody's bottom. They are like creating the best, fastest chips on the market, and suddenly they are the ones that control all of Bitcoin. China introduces capital controls, and here is the offshore yuan rising, and green is the Bitcoin price rising. So you see Bitcoin price rising with the introduction of capital controls in China.
Well, that was totally predictable. China is the greatest area for Bitcoin trading. It's got the biggest exchange volume. And, you know, Bitcoin price is looking really good right now. We've worked through the overhang of the Mt. Gox scandal. We've got a price now that's broken out of a year trend of a kind of a choppy up and down trend, a channel that's now broken above that. And you've got around the world, people have realized that having a private blockchain like they're doing at some of these banks is not the same thing as having Bitcoin. Bitcoin is decentralized, anonymous, whereas these private blockchains like Citicoin and other coins developed by the banks don't fit the bill. So now people are coming back to the godmama of the crypto space, Bitcoin. So it's the price is starting to pick up again. We're going to start to see some good price action.
The revolution of dignity that happened in 2014, it was not finished. Because they managed to overthrow the previous government. They made the former president Yanukovych to flee the country. People wanted much more, and they didn't want just the ability to travel freely with Europe. They wanted really to become part of Europe. And this is very far way to go still in Ukraine.
If you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command you this day, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you.
All land in the hands of white people is stolen property, and therefore it must be returned to black people.
If they get rid of whites, all their problems will go away.
There's a lot of greed within the white community, especially in South Africa. They're untouchable.
White farmers in South Africa are being attacked every single day.
People being tortured to death, especially elderly people.
En het my oordrom gebars, my neus gebreek, my wangbene gebreek.
Like any other race, white also find themselves affected by crime, and we are also affected.
White people live like kings and queens, out of sweat and blood of black people.
What are you going to have for dinner?
Today, we don't have anything. I'm asking from my neighbors for food.
Civil war in South Africa is inevitable.
One bullet, one settler. One bullet, one settler.
And it shall not be in the power of your hand to prevent it.
while China is dominating in the actual accumulation of Bitcoin at this point in time, and they are definitely dominating the chip space, which is very important to mining, and miners are very important to Bitcoin. They're driving up the hash rate because they're all engaging in an arms race, this ASICs arms race going on in China. Bitmain is accumulating power and Bitcoin. By the way, they're not selling, all those miners are not selling their Bitcoin. Unlike all the miners in Eastern Europe or America who are having to pay their electric bills, there are no electric bills for China. In the meantime, in the US, there is more of this normalization of Bitcoin, and 2015 is really the attempt by many participants in Bitcoin to kind of agree with the banks, try to get Goldman Sachs, try to get JP Morgan on side, try to participate in R3, this consortium of blockchain, not Bitcoin. And we have in New York the BitLicense. June 2015, the final draft of BitLicense in New York is published. Soon after publishing this final draft of the new BitLicense law in New York, which would ultimately drive all the Bitcoin industry out of New York, Ben Lawsky, who wrote this law, then joins a cryptocurrency firm. So here we have this attempt to be the first. You remember at the time, it was BitLicense is going to bring all Bitcoin industries here, and we're going to make it blockchain, not Bitcoin, and it's going to be legitimate, and it's going to be blessed by the Wall Street regulators. This is Wall Street. The New York Department of Financial Services thinks that they're going to make Bitcoin, this blockchain, not Bitcoin, they're going to host it all in New York City. So Caitlin, you are forging the path forward for Bitcoin. Bitcoin is very anti-state. It's restoring rights to the individual. But the fact is that you're being proactive. Like, it's better to go, because you know governments are going to try to create these laws, right?
Yes.
So why not just create good laws?
Well, create enabling laws instead of restricting laws. And New York, for example, created very restrictive laws that caused a number of players to leave New York. It turned out that Wyoming actually did originally have a restrictive money transmitter law. That's how I ended up getting into the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition. I tried to donate appreciated Bitcoin to my alma mater, the University of Wyoming, and they couldn't take it because of Wyoming's money transmitter law. It's very strange because Wyoming is a low regulation, small government place. And so that was such a surprise that Wyoming had one of the 3 worst money transmitter laws. So the whole thing got started with, let's go fix that. It doesn't make sense that Wyoming would be at the bottom of the list. And then the ball got rolling, and here we are.
Right. So at this time, China becomes the epicenter of Bitcoin space with the concentration of miners, and they have the cheap energy. And you also have states like New York State attempting to attract some business by introducing some legislation like the BitLicense program to attract businesses. But more importantly, around the world, different jurisdictions, different countries decided, oh, you know what? We heard this is the second coming of the internet, and we kind of missed the internet. And that turned out to be a multi-trillion-dollar industry, made a lot of people tons of money. If this is the next internet, we want to be the focus of that next wave of innovation and capital formulation. So they started to reach out to the industry. So places like Malta, places like Isle of Man, places like Singapore, they all entered the space and said, come here, we'll take your entrepreneurs, we'll take the business. And so one of the promises of Bitcoin is that instead of the central authorities coming around and seizing money from individuals whenever they go bust, that central authorities would come and asking folks for money to bail them out. And if all the money is in Bitcoin, it's in crypto, and fiat money is becoming increasingly worthless, then you saw the first hints of that in 2015 when all these states started to try to bring that business to them, because they could kind of sense the future, where fiat money would not be a bargaining chip anymore. You couldn't buy anything with fiat money. You couldn't buy influence. You couldn't buy politicians. You couldn't buy your way out of a financial crisis. The people with the hard money were the people you needed to satisfy. And those people are the people with Bitcoin.
And I think there's a massive confusion in the Bitcoin and more so in the cryptocurrency space, supposedly, around the term store of value, in that they think of it as being equivalent to these big giant bars of gold locked up in Swiss banks and vaults. And essentially, the store of value is a function of money that is practically inseparable from the medium of exchange. In other words, for something to be chosen as a medium of exchange, by necessity, somebody is using it as a store of value because they're storing value in it in order to exchange it later on, even if after a few minutes they've stored value in it. So anything that functions as a store of value in a sense of you hold it not for its own sake, but for the sake of holding on to the value so that you could then exchange that value for something else. Anything can do that job.
So they wanted to separate risk and reward by saying blockchain, not Bitcoin. And what they meant by that is they wanted all the benefits of Bitcoin without the hard work. They wanted the distributed ledger technology, the efficiency, the settlement, instant settlement. They wanted the no counterparty risk, but they didn't want the work because Bitcoin is hard. You have to mine it. It's proof of work, and it consumes a lot of electricity. There's an arms race on for the best ASIC chip. People are competing hard. You've got to build these massive mining farms. You've also got to secure your Bitcoin. You've got to find a way to keep your private keys and not lose those private keys and not have it on an exchange. So that's the hard part of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not easy. It's hard. You have to stay ever vigilant to keep your economic individual sovereignty. You have to work hard. Proof of work is not easy. It's proof of work. It's not proof of like, hey, reward. It's like, it's hard work.
No, proof of work equals cost. And cost means bottom line hit. And that's not what you want. You want everything to drop to the bottom line without any cost. You just want pure profits, no cost. And so by saying blockchain, not Bitcoin, you're saying that we'll take the efficiencies of the blockchain because it eliminates huge costs. But we don't want to actually have the cost of mining Bitcoin, storing Bitcoin, or having the problem of watching it cannibalize our fiat money fractional reserve business. We don't want any of that. We just want the savings. We just want the gravy. We just want the free money. And Wall Street grew up now on free money. There's no ethics on Wall Street of work. And the blockchain is proof of work. That's like saying proof of the absence of Wall Street.
Mining is governed by the implementation of proof of work. And then proof of work is a process that requires computational work. And basically what it does is no one can cheat. Everybody has to show the presentation of work in order to get reward. And so it actually encourages honest work.
It almost encourages, to a certain degree, altruism.
Exactly. And then also it distributes accountability. So instead of having levers of control, trying to regulate and account our fallible nature, blockchain actually distributes accountability and responsibility so that everybody abiding themselves with the rule of consensus and the basic principle of risk and reward, they themselves can regulate themselves.
So 2015 is chugging along. Is blockchain, not Bitcoin? Many of the representatives and people advocating for Bitcoin and the power of Bitcoin had disappeared from the media. None more so than Amir Taaki. Until August 22nd, 2015, and I received an email from Amir Taaki, who we had not heard from in over a year. Rojava, Activism, and Friends. This was the title of his email. Hi, Stacy. Hi, Max. I've been highly involved in Rojava activism over the last few months. He then goes on to say what the Rojava are and what they're looking for. Unfortunately, the European states have branded us terrorists. Some of us have been barred from travel with our passports taken away, and recently anti-terrorist police have been raiding some of our places and interviewing our families. He then asked for our help and an introduction to Russell Brand, who had been on the Kaiser Report, and you had introduced Russell Brand to Bitcoin.
You know, you have to think of Bitcoin is to money what E equals MC squared was to physics. It's an enormous discovery in the history of money itself, and it's offering enormous potential. And I see that others in the political space are jumping on, and I would hate to see this incredible power go into the hands of these same guys who have power now when everyone else could have that power. And, when you were writing Revolution back a year ago or so, we chatted briefly about doing a few paragraphs on cryptocurrency. So this is, it didn't make the cut into the book, but now we're talking about it.
I couldn't get around to meet you. You're a hard person. I should have dealt directly with
But
Stacey.
now we're talking about it more. You see what I'm saying? This is the revolution. The revolution is in the blockchain. That's my thought about it.
So here you have Amir Taqi fighting ISIS. Bitcoin is a revolution, and every revolution, of course, has an armed wing. And here he was. He was in Syria with the Rojava, the Kurds, and he was bringing Bitcoin to them. They were reorganizing their economic system. So here, if Charlie Shrem was Bitcoin's first felon, Amir Taqi was Bitcoin's first revolutionary.
Well, Bitcoin is hard money, and hard money begets free trade. And free trade, honest trade, is peaceful trade. And that is a direct conflict with people who prefer fiat money trade and counterfeit trade and pushing war. So you always have this conflict between love and hate. And, not to get too religious or anything, but the message of, 2,000 years ago of love came up against the state, the Roman state. But how did the message of love spread in the early days of Christianity? It spread on the roads that had been built by the Romans. So the Romans, by building those roads that connected the empire, set the stage for the collapse of the empire, because a message of anti-war, anti-empire, was able to just walk down the road. And the apostles just spread the message of love. Now, Bitcoin is hard money. It walks on the road of the internet that's already there into the social media minds of the collective unconscious with peaceful trade with hard money. And that's what the warmongers and the fiat money people hate. That's why Blythe Masters was sent in to try to destroy it. That's why Jamie Dimon is all upset, because it destroys the empire of fiat money warmongers.
So we end the year of 2015 with Amir Taqi, a very OG Bitcoiner, under house arrest, his passport taken. We have Blythe Masters, the inventor of the credit default swap, which then took down the global economy and gave rise to the birth of Bitcoin. She's on the cover of Bloomberg Markets. It's all about blockchain. Then November 2015, the final Silk Road auction took place with around 44,000 Bitcoins being sold to various buyers of separate blocks. This was the third and final Silk Road auction to take place, in which seized Bitcoins were sold to the highest bidders.
It's remarkable, really, because that same government is accumulating massive quantities of debt, and they're getting rid of the only hard money that they'll ever have, except for this phantom supply of gold apparently in Fort Knox that hasn't been audited in quite some time. But here's Bitcoin that is actually the answer to their debt problem, the answer to their enslavement of themselves through their own reliance on financial engineering to create free money. And they just give it away, essentially, for a price that, in retrospect, will be considered to be a lot closer to zero than where we're headed.